Oh, come in, come in. Oh, hi, nice to see you. You find me on the last day of the year, the last day of 2022, and apropos of that, I was going to read you a poem of Thomas Hardy's. I mean, Hardy, of course, is best known as a novelist, a rather bleak novelist, Tess of the D'Urbervilles and all of that, inexorable fate, rending the hearts of the innocent. But in fact, G.K. Chesterton once described Thomas Hardy as the village atheist contemplating the village idiot, which is a bit hard. But the interesting thing is that towards the end of his life, Hardy began to write poetry. He began to write poetry partly under the impetus of the death of his wife and his sudden realization that he'd loved her all this time and hadn't really shown it. So he wrote incredibly moving poems to her, like that one that's almost in waltz time that begins, "Woman much missed, how you call to me, call to me." But I was going to read you a poem which he wrote on the last day, on December the 31st, 1900, with some foreboding, looking forward towards the 20th century. Anyway, I was looking for my collected poems of Hardy, and it's this is the trouble with, even though it's a year and a half since we moved and all the books are behind books, I can't find it. But fortunately, I have on my desk, do have a seat, I included that poem in the anthology I did for Advent, Christmas and Epiphany, an anthology called Waiting on the Word. So I can read it to you from that. And I've always loved this poem. I originally included it in a chapter of a much bigger book of mine called Faith, Hope and Poetry. And I had a chapter called Doubting Faith, Reticent Hope. What I was trying to show in that chapter was that sometimes the heart knows better than the head, as it were. Sometimes the part of you that feels and reads and hears and ultimately, if you're lucky, makes poetry, sort of imaginatively apprehends, intuits a little bit more than your reasoning can manage, or your reasoning can manage at the time. It seems to have access to truths to which the reason may come in the end, but which the imagination gets first. And I wanted to look at poets who, with the reasoning off the top of their head, had a very bleak view of the world, but who, when they wrote poetry, nevertheless found strange, almost transcendent gleams of light of hope breaking in, almost against their own intentions. But if they're really honest poets, they include that in the poetry. They may say to the reader, "I don't know what to make of this any more than you may, but it happened and here it is." And this poem, The Darkling Thrush, is a supreme example of that. He goes out on a really bleak December day, and there's all this imagery of things of being dry and sere and brittle, and tangled vine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres. It's the full Hardy. And then he hears this thrush, and he can't help but apprehend the joy in the thrush's song, and he just leaves you with both of these things in a very open way at the end. The title, The Darkling Thrush, is a really interesting title because the word darkling doesn't actually occur in the poem at all, apart from the title. But the word darkling, a very beautiful word, has a kind of poetic history of which I'm sure Hardy is fully aware. In Paradise Lost, Book 3, Milton, in his blindness, talks about hearing a nightingale that sings darkling in shadiest covert hid. And Keats, later writing his Ode to a Nightingale, has this beautiful line where he takes the word darkling and thinks of it of himself. He says, darkling, I listen. And it's as though Hardy, by choosing that word, is saying, well, Milton and Keats got nightingales. All I got is this little blast beruffled thrush. But hey, I've got to work with what I've got. But which is very much in the Hardy style. But this is, I think, an astonishing poem. So let me read it to you as a sort of New Year's Eve. It seems right to read at the end of this particular year because it has been, frankly, a bleak year. A year of war in Ukraine, a year of financial crisis and cost of living squeezes and all kinds of tragedy. And yet, as another poet, Emily Dickinson, says, hope is the thing with feathers, And maybe that's really what he hears singing, not just a thrush. So here's The Darkling Thrush by Thomas Hardy. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre grey. The winter's dregs made desolate the weakening eye of day. The tangled bine stems scored the sky like strings of broken lyres, and all mankind that haunted nigh had sought their household fires. The land's sharp features seemed to be the century's corpse outlent, his crypt, the cloudy canopy, the wind, his death lament. The ancient pulse of germ and birth was shrunken hard and dry, and every spirit upon earth seemed fervorless as I. At once a voice arose among the bleak twigs overhead in a full-hearted evensong of joy illimited. An aged thrush, frail, gaunt and small, in blast-beruffled plume, had chosen thus to fling his soul upon the growing gloom. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around, that I could think there trembled through his happy midnight air some blessed hope, whereof he knew, and I was unaware. That's an astonishing poem. It's so beautiful because it calls together these quite different registers of language. You get all the spectre grey, lament, corpse, canopy, all of the fervorless. And then suddenly, atheist though he may be, in order to try and give you an account of what he heard, Hardy finds himself, as it were, you might say almost illicitly, borrowing language from the very church that he rejects. He can't describe the thrush's song as anything but a full-hearted even song. And he has to use words like blessed and soul. And I love this final statement. He hasn't changed his mind about the bleak prospects of the 20th century, and in that he was right. So little cause for carolings of such ecstatic sound was written on terrestrial things afar or nigh around. But you see, he's used the word terrestrial things. He now needs to qualify all things with the word terrestrial. And as soon as you've said terrestrial, you summon up at least the possibility of celestial, of the heavenly kind of emerging and giving you some glimpse or glimmering in the midst of the darkness of the earthly, the terrestrial. And I love the kind of slightly conditional mood of the language here. He's not saying I did think, but he's saying I could. A possibility was open to me. And because it's open to Hardy, it's open to you, the listener or reader. I could think there trembled through his happy good night air some blessed hope. And hope has a capital letter, some blessed hope, whereof he knew, and I was unaware. I think it's also just a supreme touch that this poem, which whatever else it is a poem of supreme and finely tuned awareness, should end with the word unaware. Hardy says, I was unaware. Well, he may have thought he was unaware, but I think his poem proves otherwise. Anyway, Have a very good evening if you're celebrating tonight, and have a happy new year. Nice to see you.